settle in, get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket over your lap, because tonight we are going somewhere that textbooks were too polite to go. We are going to talk about the lies of the Middle Ages. Not small lies, not someone misremembering a date or exaggerating a battle. We are talking about entire people. Kings and popes, heroes and holy figures, characters so vivid, so detailed, so convincingly placed inside real history that for hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years, almost nobody stopped to ask the obvious question. Did any of these people actually exist? The answer, in more cases than you would expect, is probably not. And yet, their stories shaped empires, inspired armies, launched pilgrimages, built cathedrals, and in at least one case, gave rise to a piece of furniture that still shows up in modern fiction, film, and video games. Tonight we are going to walk through them one by one, slowly, because each of these stories deserves to breathe. We will talk about a pope who gave birth in the middle of a papal procession, a king whose round table may have been invented by a French poet, a Christian saint who might have been a recycled pagan god, a prophet whose entire kingdom was invented to comfort a frightened continent, a saint who possibly borrowed her story from a Buddhist monk, and more. By the time we are done, you will look at medieval history slightly differently, not with suspicion exactly, more with a knowing smile. Because the Middle Ages were not just a period of swords and plagues and dark castles. They were a period of extraordinary storytelling, and sometimes the line between story and history got a little blurry. Let us begin. Let us start with a story that has everything: gender disguise, forbidden ambition, conspiracy at the highest levels of the medieval church, and a very, very public ending. The year is, supposedly, somewhere around 855 AD. The setting is Rome, the heart of Christendom, the most powerful city in the Western world at the time. And somewhere in that city, according to centuries of medieval tradition, a remarkable thing was happening. A woman had become pope. The story goes something like this. A young woman, born in Germany, sometimes said to be English, was extraordinarily gifted. She was brilliant, curious, hungry for knowledge, at a time when women were largely excluded from formal education. So she did what any brilliant, resourceful young woman of the 9th century might have done. She disguised herself as a man, and not just casually. She committed. She studied theology, she became a monk, then a scholar, then a teacher. She gained a reputation for extraordinary wisdom and learning. She climbed the ranks of the church slowly but steadily, and eventually her intelligence and her reputation were so great that when a vacancy appeared in the papal seat, she was elected. Pope Joan, the first and, depending on your source, only female pope. She managed to conceal her identity for 2 years, which, if nothing else, stands as one of the most successful undercover operations in history. 2 years, at the top of the most scrutinized institution in the medieval world. That alone is remarkable, whether or not you believe any of it. But then came the moment that ended everything. During a grand public procession through Rome, very ceremonial, very dignified, robes everywhere, crowds lining the streets, Pope Joan suddenly went into labor and gave birth in the street, which is, objectively, a bold way to reveal you have been living a double life. In some versions of the legend, she died immediately. In others, the crowd reacted with fury. Either way, it ended dramatically. Medieval storytellers were not fans of subtle conclusions. The historical reality. Here is the less dramatic reality. There is absolutely no contemporary evidence that Pope Joan ever existed. None. The story first appears in written form in the 13th century, about 400 years after she supposedly reigned. Medieval papal records from the 9th century are, surprisingly, quite thorough. There is no mysterious missing pope, no awkward 2-year blank labelled, "We do not talk about that one." The succession moves cleanly from Leo IV to Benedict III with no unexplained gap. Coins survive from both pontificates. Documents survive. Witnesses survive, in ink at least. It is simply not there. Where did the story come from? So, where did the story come from? Most historians believe it likely began as satire or anti-papal propaganda. The medieval church was powerful, wealthy, politically entangled, and not universally loved, creating a story in which it was humiliated by its own leadership. That spreads nicely. It is scandalous. It is symbolic. It is memorable. Medieval audiences loved a good scandal. There is also a theory that the story may have grown from misunderstandings about certain church rituals, or from older folk tales about disguised women in male roles. But wherever it started, it found an audience, and once a story finds an audience, it tends to grow legs. What makes Pope Joan fascinating is not that she probably never existed, it is that for centuries, educated people believed she did. Pilgrims were shown supposed evidence. Later, church rituals were retroactively explained as safeguards against another Joan. Chroniclers repeated the tale confidently, and confidence, apparently, was all it took. Pope Joan may never have ruled Rome, but she absolutely ruled medieval gossip, which, if we are being honest, might be even more powerful. She got her own trading card in a tarot deck. She got a chapter in a text called De Mulieribus Claris, on famous women, by Boccaccio, who treated her as historical fact. She was used by Protestant reformers as evidence of Catholic corruption. She was cited, debated, defended, and denied for 6 centuries. Not bad for someone who may never have existed. Now we move from papal scandal to national obsession. King Arthur, the once and future king, wielder of Excalibur, leader of the Knights of the Round Table, owner of the most famous piece of furniture in medieval literature, Camelot, Merlin, Lancelot, Guinevere, epic battles, betrayal, destiny. It feels historical. It feels ancient. It feels foundational, like bedrock, like something that must be true simply because it is so vivid. There is just one small problem. The version of Arthur that most people imagine is largely the result of 12th century creative writing. The earliest mentions, early references to an Arthur do appear in sources written centuries after the time he supposedly lived, around the 5th or 6th century AD, in the chaotic decades after Rome withdrew from Britain and Anglo-Saxon invaders were pushing westward. A 9th century Welsh text, the Historia Brittonum, mentions an Arthur as a great military leader who fought against Saxon invaders. He wins 12 battles. He carries the image of the Virgin Mary on his shoulders, or possibly his shield, depending on translation. He is brave and important, but he is not a king. He has no Camelot. He has no Round Table. He has no Merlin, no Guinevere, no Excalibur, no knights on quests for sacred objects. He is just a name, a warrior, possibly a war leader, possibly a figure who, over generations, absorbed the stories of multiple real fighters into a single legendary person. Geoffrey of Monmouth changes everything. Then, in 1136, a Welsh cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth published something called the Histo, Rye of the Kings of Britain, and this is where Arthur, as we know him, truly comes alive. Geoffrey gave Arthur everything: a kingdom, a court, a lineage tracing back to Troy, campaigns across Europe, a magical sword, a legendary advisor named Merlin, a queen, a great betrayal by his nephew Mordred, a final, mournful voyage to the mystical Isle of Avalon. Geoffrey called it history. Most of his contemporaries were suspicious. Where did he get all this? Asked one 12th century historian. A good question, and one that has never been satisfactorily answered. A century later, French writers, especially a poet named Chrétien de Troyes, took Geoffrey's framework and added the Round Table, the Knights, the quest for the Holy Grail, and the doomed love triangle of Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot, layer upon layer, author upon author, century upon century. Why the legend mattered politically. Arthur became more than a story. He became a political tool. English kings claimed descent from him. The Tudor dynasty, Henry VII, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, used Arthur's legend to legitimize their rule, to suggest they were the fulfillment of a great destiny rather than the winners of a recent civil war. Henry VII named his eldest son Arthur. Cathedrals displayed supposed Arthurian relics. Tourists visited supposed Arthurian graves, including one at Glastonbury that was almost certainly a medieval marketing fabrication. Was there a real Arthur? Possibly. Some warrior. Some leader. Some kernel of truth, buried under 8 centuries of storytelling. But the Arthur we love, the shining king in Camelot, the sword in the stone, the round table and its impossible ideals of chivalry and honour, that Arthur was built by writers. And writers, it turns out, are very good at making things feel real. Even today, Arthur fills films and novels and television series and video games. He is one of the most recognised names in the world. He is, in the truest sense, a fiction that became more powerful than most facts. And perhaps that tells us something important. Perhaps certain ideas, justice, courage, the hope that good leadership is possible, are so necessary that humanity will invent a king to embody them, if one does not conveniently appear. Our next figure is less famous than Arthur, but in some ways more interesting, because Arthur was built from old legend. Prester John was built from fear. The 12th century was not a comfortable time for European Christians. The Crusades were going badly. The Holy Land was in danger. Muslim armies were powerful, organized, and winning. Rumors were spreading of new threats, the Mongols to the east, pressure from all directions. And somewhere in the Christian world, the mood was shifting from confidence to something closer to anxiety. And then, in 1145, a hopeful rumor began to circulate. The story of the great Christian king, somewhere to the east. The story went, there was a mighty Christian kingdom. A vast empire richer than anything in Europe, ruled by a powerful Christian king-priest, a figure both monarch and man of God, named Prester John, prester meaning priest. And this great king was on his way. He was coming to save the Holy Land. He was coming to rescue Christendom. People believed it. Deeply, in a world without fast communication, without the ability to simply check, a compelling story from a credible-sounding source could travel very far. And then, in 1165, a letter began circulating across Europe, supposedly written by Prester John himself. The letter described his kingdom in extraordinary detail. Magnificent palaces with roofs of gold, endless wealth, magical fountains of youth. A land of 62 kings who all paid him tribute, a realm so vast and so blessed that it made every European kingdom look modest by comparison. It even listed the wonders of his land, salamanders that lived in fire, unicorns, cynocephaly, dog-headed people, and rivers that ran with precious gems. It was, of course, a forgery. The search across centuries, historians today are quite certain that Prester John never existed. The letter was almost certainly written in Europe, probably by a German or Italian author trying to encourage crusading enthusiasm or papal reform. The kingdom it described was pure fantasy, a wish dressed up as geography. But for 2 centuries, European rulers treated Prester John as real. Embassies were dispatched east looking for him. Letters were written to him and sent into the void. Maps were drawn with his kingdom clearly marked, first in Central Asia, then in India, then, as those locations failed to produce a great Christian empire, in Africa. Ethiopia, specifically, became the new candidate. The Portuguese, when they made contact with Ethiopia in the late 15th century, were hoping, genuinely hoping, that the Ethiopian emperor might be Prester John or his descendant. They were disappointed to find a kingdom that was real but somewhat smaller and considerably more complicated than legend promised. What is remarkable is how long the illusion lasted. Prester John was always treated as geographically elusive rather than historically non-existent. The empire was always just over the next mountain. Just beyond the next expedition, he represented something too valuable to give up. The hope that someone powerful was on your side. That help was coming. That out there, beyond the known maps, a great ally waited. Prester John was never real, but the longing that created him was very real indeed. And that longing for a powerful, just, distant saviour who will arrive before it is too late is perhaps the most human feeling in this entire story. From a mythical Christian king to a mythical English outlaw. Robin Hood, the man in Lincoln Green, the noble thief of Sherwood Forest, the enemy of the Sheriff of Nottingham, the hero who stole from the rich and gave to the poor. The story is so vivid, so detailed, so convincingly English, that it is genuinely surprising to discover that there is not a single shred of reliable historical evidence that Robin Hood was a real person. The literary origins, the earliest references to Robin Hood appear in 14th century literature, most famously in a poem called Piers Plowman, written around 1377, where a character mentions being familiar with the ballads of Robin Hood. This tells us the stories were already popular by then. It tells us nothing about whether a real man inspired them. And here is the part that surprises most people. Early Robin Hood ballads do not place him in the familiar Nottingham of Richard the Lionheart's era. In the oldest versions, he is not a dispossessed nobleman fighting for a good king while a bad king sits on the throne. He is a yeoman, a common man, a free peasant. The political framing, the crusading king, the noble identity, all of those were added later as different writers in different centuries reshaped the legend for different audiences. Medieval peasants needed a yeoman hero. Later, aristocratic audiences needed a noble one. Hollywood audiences, in 1991, needed a mullet and Bryan Adams. The story adapted. The historical candidates. Historians have proposed dozens of possible real-world Robins. There are records of men named Robert Hood or Robert of Locksley, scattered through English documents of the 13th and 14th centuries. Some were criminals, some were outlaws, some fit pieces of the story, but none of them fit the whole story. And most historians now believe Robin Hood is a composite, an accumulatio, of outlaw folklore, peasant fantasy, and political wish fulfillment that eventually crystallized around a single name and a single forest. The Sheriff of Nottingham. That was a real job. There were many sheriffs of Nottingham over the centuries, some of whom were genuinely unpopular. Little John? Unknown. Maid Marian? She appears to have been borrowed from a completely separate folk tradition of springtime May Day festivals, grafted onto the Robin Hood story sometime in the 15th century. Robin Hood as a complete figure appears to be a fiction, but as a symbol, the little man against the powerful institution, the common person refusing to accept an unjust system, he has never stopped being useful. And perhaps that is why, 700 years later, he still wears the green. We end tonight with a figure who may be the most instructive of all, because his legend did not just entertain people. It helped build an entire nation. William Tell, the Swiss folk hero, the crossbowman who refused to bow before a tyrant's hat, was forced to shoot an apple off his son's head as punishment, escaped, and eventually led the rebellion that gave birth to the Swiss Confederation. The story is so beloved in Switzerland that for centuries it was taught as history. Monuments were built, statues were raised, a famous opera was composed. A whole national identity was partly anchored in Tell's act of defiance against Habsburg oppression. The historical problem. There is no contemporary historical evidence for William Tell, no tax records, no court documents, no letters, no chronicle from the period that mentions him. The earliest sources for his story appear over a century after he supposedly lived. And scholars have noted something even more interesting. Versions of the apple shooting story, a skilled archer forced to demonstrate his abilities by shooting something off a L, oved one's head as punishment, appear in Norse sagas, Danish ballads, and other Northern European traditions, well before Tell enters the record. The story type is very old. Tell himself may simply be the Swiss version of a widespread folk archetype about skill, defiance, and love under impossible pressure. What his story built, what is extraordinary about William Tell, is not that he was probably fictional, it is that his story did real historical work. The Swiss Confederation needed a founding myth, a moment of heroic resistance that justified their independence and unified their identity across different cantons that spoke different languages and had different traditions. William Tell provided that. He was the story a young nation told about itself. And stories, as we have seen tonight, can be more powerful than facts. The Swiss did not invent this strategy. Every nation does it. Every nation has figures, sometimes historical, sometimes legendary, sometimes something in between, who carry the weight of national meaning, who represent what the nation believes itself to be. That is not cynical. It is actually rather beautiful, because it means that human beings have always understood, on some level, that meaning and identity require narrative, that facts alone are not enough, that we need stories, even invented ones, to understand who we are and where we came from. We have visited a lot of people tonight. A pope who gave birth in a procession, a king whose round table was built by French poets, a Christian emperor who never existed but was needed so badly that half of Europe went looking for him, an outlaw who might be nobody, or might be everybody, a Swiss hero who helped create a country he probably never saw. None of them were quite real. All of them were completely necessary. And maybe that is the most interesting thing about medieval history. It was not just a period of real events, it was a period of necessary fictions. Stories that filled in gaps, gave comfort in fear, justified power, challenged power, created community, and gave people something to believe in when the world felt uncertain. The Middle Ages invented a lot of things we still use: universities, cathedrals, parliaments, legal traditions, the concept of chivalry, even if it was never quite practiced the way the stories suggested, and legends. Beautiful, durable, surprisingly resilient legends. So the next time someone tells you a story that sounds a little too perfect, a little too symbolic, a little too conveniently timed, maybe do not dismiss it immediately. Ask yourself instead, what did people need to believe, and why? Because the answer to that question will tell you more about the past than any document ever could. Sleep well, and dream of round tables, green forests, and a pope who kept a rather remarkable secret. Good night.